Hi, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat where we're going to focus on the recent disruptions to the container supply chains here in the United States and the role that the Federal Maritime Commission, which is charged with regulating container shipping in the U.S. trades, can play and is playing in addressing the situation. My name is John Gallagher. I'm senior editor at FreightWaves, and we're very pleased to have with us today Federal Maritime Commission Commissioner Carl Bentzel. Carl is one of 5 commissioners at the FMC, including Chairman Michael Curry. Commissioner Bentzel, who has an extensive background in transportation policy here in Washington, D.C., was nominated to his position on the board in June of 2020 and began serving on the board in December of last year. So welcome, Commissioner Bentzel, to Global Supply Chain Week.
John, nice to see you. Nice to talk again.
Great. So I'll get right into the issues here that are facing FMC. So, we've seen these booming imports and the effects of COVID-19 straining container supply chains while causing transportation rates to surge and major port congestion. In fact, my colleague Greg Miller posted a story just last week with a Coast Guard video. I don't know if you saw it, Carl. It's an overhead video showing this massive buildup of ships outside Los Angeles. It's just, glaring evidence of what's going on. So just kind of the first basic question I want to ask you. So what is the status of any efforts that the FMC and commissioners like yourself separately have been undertaking to address this problem?
Yeah, John, thanks for referencing it. I am representing the views of myself as an individual commissioner, but there are activities going on both with respect to the commission itself. We have fact-finding 29 going on. It's an investigation into conditions at the ports of LA and New York primarily. And it really looks at what the impacts of COVID have been on the transportation chain, the supply chain. And as you said, we went from COVID-19 early part of the year where we had reductions of anywhere between 20 and 30% of containerized cargo to a surge, in May, June of almost the same amount, 20 to 30% increases in supply, and that's continued. So we're looking at those issues. I can't really get too much further because we're still working on it. We broadened the investigation to look at the issue of detention and demurrage and the guidelines that the agency issued for compliance with that. Also on the issue of exports and denial refusals, essentially. In certain instances, allegations have been made to deny export service, and also just the levels of equipment and problems that we've had with respect to that.
Sorry.
So individually, I have been, as all of the commissioners, in contact with carriers, with terminals, with IEPs, the equipment providers, trucking associations, trying to get a greater gauge on what's going on. So we've made independent outreach to talk to the industry and get a greater sense of what's going on. So that's sort of where we are at present.
Yeah, I understand also, Carl, today is February 17th that we're recording this, but you'll be meeting the FMC was to be meeting today for an update, I believe, on the fact-finding investigation looking into these issues, including demurrage. Can you inform us about what that update might be?
Well, I think it's next steps. I can't really go further because it actually hasn't happened. Commissioner Dye, who's leading the fact-finding, we've spoken, and so she wants to give an update, and I don't think we're going to consider anything. It's more an opportunity to get the latest. It potentially could lead to actions, but I can't go much further because it's speculative right now.
Gotcha. Now, related to this, You touched on it a bit, but there's been a big issue with exporters, with U.S. exporters who have been complaining that the container lines have not been holding up their end of the bargain, so to speak, in terms of container service that they feel like they should be getting, either through excessive rates or failure to provide equipment at all. I mean, so how do you stand on this, and what action can the FMC take on that particular issue?
So first, I'd say the issues that are creating the challenge, in part, are reductions, I guess I would say, in the amount of available equipment, containerized containers. I am looking closely at the supply of containers. Most containers are made in China, and it seems that there was at least a slowdown as a result of COVID, and reductions continue in terms of the ability to supply what's needed to the market with a big surplus. So there was a challenge that was sort of unique. And early on, we got had some allegations that were made that service was being denied. And you mentioned the question of increased rates and reasonableness. We have jurisdiction under our prohibited acts section to evaluate whether there's unreasonable refusals to deal. Clearly, a denial of service is a violation of the act, and we can take action to investigate that, verify it, and potentially issue penalties for noncompliance. Where it gets a little bit trickier is, this is not an unfettered obligation to provide export service. It's an unreasonable refusal to deal. So whether or not they're charging more because equipment needs to be repositioned, or there are other factors, for instance, the amount of time, free time that they would give on containers to be unloaded in China, that's much more questionable. It gets into an evaluation of very tricky area of law to define, and that's what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. But we have authority clearly to challenge any action where a carrier denies service in the export. And Commissioners Maffei and I wrote to the World Shipping Council. We alerted them that this was an obligation, and I'm not hearing the same sorts of complaints on refusals to deal, and so it seems to be abating a little bit. And this occurred October, November timeframe.
And it's abating, you said.
We're not hearing as many complaints about that. There are complaints about other issues, rate increases, just the availability of equipment and getting it positioned, and other types of complaints, but not the outright denials of service that we heard earlier on, as the surplus of cargo and the unavailability of containers started to build up.
Gotcha. So related to that, regarding, you were talking about container supply. So related to that in the supply chain is actual vessel capacity management. So we've seen some of the major container lines like Maersk, for example, pull back capacity last year in terms of space on their ships, and now moving that capacity back into place to deal with this surge in demand that we've been seeing. So this can have some serious impacts too, though, on container rates that have jumped to unprecedented levels. So where does the FMC draw the line between the ability of the liner operators to manage their vessel capacity as they see fit, and the rate and service obligations that they have to the cargo owners and the retailers?
Well, it's a tricky issue. It's governed under the terms of the original space sharing arrangements that have been provided to the FMC, that we review and determine whether or not we should take action to enjoin its application. So there's three alliances essentially that operate together, and those agreements stipulate in the agreement that they have authority to reduce capacity to address market conditions, essentially. And so the early part of COVID was clearly reductions in substantial volumes, not really dictated by the carriers themselves or the market. And so they took actions to reduce and to cancel blank sailings at that point. And I think that was probably consistent with their authority under the agreements. The FMC has continuing authority to evaluate the unreasonableness of rates. And so in taking that action, clearly they sustained market conditions and pricing. And what has happened, I think, since that time is there have been substantial rate increases, especially on the spot market, where you're seeing a doubling, in some cases even up to a tripling of certain rates. So we continue to monitor those and evaluate them. We get reports every 2 weeks, I believe, that give us benchmark pricing rates, and we evaluate all of the outside data that's there. So we can take action if it gets to a point where we determine it's unreasonable. It's a little challenging, honestly, because 8 of the past 10 years, the carriers didn't make money. So you're looking at a potentially a market correction. So we'll continue to evaluate those and see whether they get to a point where we feel we would have actionable rights to challenge them. And so that's where we are now. But they're high. You know, the rates are high.
Yeah. Getting into more of the COVID issues. So the FMC and U.S. ports generally have been pushing for a higher vaccine priority on the waterfront. Could you provide an update on where things stand with that, Commissioner?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that has occurred since COVID-19 is, if, in my view, a recognition on the extreme value of the supply chain, maritime containerized shipping, and the intermodal assets, the trucking, the rail, the longshoremen, the shippers, the freight forwarders that contribute to the movement of that cargo. So you've seen aviation, for instance, with reductions of up to 50%, cruise ships being totally canceled. But if you look at containerized shipping, in fact, it's been a market that has sustained throughout this year despite substantial economic disruption. And so really it's been that which has sustained our ability to operate both with the provision of PPE and e-commerce and things that we need to work from home and adjust to COVID. So the end of the year last year was a little bit lower, but not that much lower than the previous year. And it really shows how reliant we are on this aspect of our transportation chain. And I feel that has to be recognized. We need to take steps to protect that going forward to make sure. So both Commissioner Maffei and I wrote to Congress. I've worked on some op-eds. And the issue of how to provide vaccinations and equipment is largely left at the state level. But we're trying to emphasize the need to protect this aspect of our economy and our ability to respond to ensure that they're getting some priority. I'm not going to question that nursing homes and healthcare workers shouldn't have priority, but below them, by not too much in my view, is the transportation sector that continues to provide the supplies that we rely on. So there was an amendment in Congress to expand a sort of priority for maritime. It's still pending. They're still doing the Budget Reconciliation Act, and so I'm not clear where they are legislatively. But again, there are resources at the state level, and hopefully at that level, they'll get some recognition in the industry about the vital role they play in supplying.
Were you referring to the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program?
That's right. So that's
Yeah,
a legislation that's been passed. It hasn't been funded yet. So
it hasn't been funded. I understand though that there was an amendment in this recent COVID-19 relief bill to fund it that did not go through as part of the relief package. So is that it?
so yeah, that's what I'd heard as well. I sort of surprised, but it seemed that most of the amendments were defeated on the bill on the House side. So it's a long way to go, and hopefully they'll get some recognition. And even if the amendment uh, doesn't pass, there's ways that Congress can direct attention to this area. So hopefully something will emerge as they go through the process of finalizing legislation.
Gotcha, gotcha. Actually, if we could turn briefly to something that's been happening here this week. Again, when this airs, things might be better smoothed out. But we've been reporting on this freezing weather that has hit much of the southern and midwestern ports, or I'm sorry, parts of the country this week, which is affecting intermodal, the container intermodal supply chain, most directly the railroads intermodal network. I mean, could you just touch on, Commissioner, how an event like this could exacerbate what's already going on with the disruptions in the container
Sure.
chains?
So we have seen as a result of deviation of a need to deviate from the LA Long Beach port just because the volumes are building up. And you referenced Greg Miller's shots from the Coast Guard, which are truly spectacular. I urge anyone that hasn't seen that to go to your site and look at it because it shows so much. But there's been some deviation as a result of that. I think the carriers and the shippers are looking about rerouting cargo. They've looked to the Pacific Northwest. There's options in Savannah and Charleston. And so you're seeing some increases in that. So there's a natural movement there just to help relieve some of the pressure in LA Long Beach at present. And so something like this, and I was recently in Savannah and Charleston late last year, and both are investing substantial resources in connecting to railroad intermodal services. Hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, and so they're aggressively working to expand their market into the interior using rail investment. And so something like this slows things down, and it contributes to continued sort of challenges on the West Coast.
Right, right. Also, another issue, if I could, while we have you here, Commissioner, there's been this recent spate of containers falling off container ships. I know that happens occasionally, but it's there's been quite an uptick in the last several months. How concerning is that to you? And what can the FMC? Is the FMC looking at anything on that front? And what can the FMC do, if anything, on that?
Well, it's more of an issue in terms of safety. It's a Coast Guard issue. However, we have authority, for instance, on cargo misdeclaration. So that's a violation of our statute. So we can look at issues where someone has intentionally been uh, labeling cargo to get a better rate, for instance. So if this contributed to stability or issues related to stowage, it could be something that we look at. But frankly, it's more of a Coast Guard safety angle. But I will say it affects the whole industry, and the challenges that we have when a ship loses a substantial amount of cargo is massive because these are sharing containers, and so there's a economic dislocation that's substantial, and so it affects more than just one particular carrier. So
Right, right. Yeah, no, thank you for providing kind of that background and clarification. That's more of a safety issue than an economic issue that you guys regulate. And so just lastly, before we wrap up, Commissioner, can you, President Biden has been populating the administration with appointees in cabinet positions and throughout the federal agencies. Can you provide any update as to when we might see the Biden administration's appointee to the to head the Federal Maritime Commission?
I can't really provide too much. We've met with the transition team. All of the commissioners met with the transition team. And so we talked about our agency, the functions that we're doing, what we're working on. And so there's some meeting at that. I'm sure that we're a little bit further down the line from, the secretarial positions and the agencies. We are an independent agency. The president is authorized to appoint a chairman. So I expect we'll get something at some point in the near future, but no new information that I could share on that one.
Sure. No, appreciate it. Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to have to wrap up. I'd like to thank you once again, Commissioner Bentzel, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today and give us your regulatory perspective on U.S. supply chains.
John, it's always a pleasure to speak.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned for the next panel.